Hey guys, tonight we kick off with the extraordinary story of a woman whose life blended artistry, resilience, and a deep misunderstanding by much of the Western audience, the geisha. Before you settle in, take a second to hit like on the video and subscribe, but only if you truly appreciate the content I create, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always intriguing to discover who's tuning in from various corners of the globe. Now, lower the lights, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle ambient noise, and let's gently embark on this evening's exploration together. You come into the world in Edo, the vibrant center of Japan, teeming with tea houses, rice merchants, roaming monks, and at least 4 individuals per street who believe they're reborn samurai lords. You're a young girl, so your future is already limited to 3 captivating historical paths. Wed someone unexciting, join a convent and dwell in remorse, or join the okiya, the geisha residence, and devote the following 20 years to serving tea to intoxicated nobles while acting as though it's liberating. You're 6 years old. You still find insects fascinating, and you're unaware that your parents have chosen your fate. You're destined to become a geisha, not immediately. Today you're being led through the avenues in your finest kimono, which feels scratchy and overly snug. But shortly, your relaxed days of treats and rests will give way to a strict regimen focused on repressing emotions. The okiya resembles a blend of a library and a temple that produced an offspring which matured into something aloof. The lady who greets you at the entrance is the okisan, the geisha house matron. She's the type who can assess your value simply from the manner of your bow. You attempt a smile. She doesn't reciprocate. Your parents offer a profound bow, exchange a few phrases, and depart, leaving you as if in a courteous exchange of captives. You've been formally transferred. You're not being adopted. You're now an asset. No need to fret, you'll master the art of navigating the hardship with poise. You're now a shikomi, an elaborate term for a youngster who cleans. You'll polish floors, ready baths, transport water, and sometimes weep quietly into your garment, naturally, in silence. Your role is to observe the geisha, remain mute, and learn through immersion. You rest in the corridor, eat after everyone else, and you're indebted to the house for the rice you accidentally dropped. The geisha glide by you like ethereal figures. Their hairstyles are meticulously shaped, their movements are soundless, their expressions convey, "Don't dare to exhale too noisily." You're merely an absorbent figure in clogs, but you're observing. You're absorbing. And if your joints endure, someday you too could sweep through a space without instructions to retrieve linens. Your routines commence prior to dawn and conclude when your spine ceases to cooperate. You clean tatami mats, tend charcoal flames, launder kimono material worth more than your essence, and retrieve items. Constantly retrieving footwear, water, tea, additional water, the superior clogs, the alternate superior clogs. By midday, you've traversed more distance than most warriors cover in a year, and woe to you if you create sound. Shikomi are required to be mute, silent like an eerie dwelling. Utter words only when addressed, and when addressed reply promptly, but not overly swiftly or it's impolite. Also, avoid direct eye contact with elder geisha unless they're gazing at you, in which case you're now staring excessively. At this stage, even blinking feels like a diplomatic maneuver. You're instructed informally. No structured lessons exist. Your whole learning process involves watching, embarrassment, and iteration. You grasp how to tie an obi by observing it done rapidly. You rehearse bowing until your back lodges a protest. You strive not to shed tears on your 15th botched tea service, yet gradually you begin to comprehend how they position the fan precisely, how chuckles are synchronized like percussion, how strolling is a ballet of digits and rhythm. You come to see that geisha life isn't merely about appearance. It's about accuracy, command, and possessing the interpersonal agility of a negotiator in a minefield. And still, you're only a shikomi. You're unseen until you're needed, and even then, you're somewhat unseen, but now holding a cloth. The senior girls could be compassionate if fortune favors you, or they might view you as a mobile lesson in caution. In any case, you maintain a low profile and stay attentive. Because here's the hidden truth. Everyone originated from this point. Even the most elegant, impeccably composed geisha in the residence once scrubbed this very surface while being reprimanded for wiping utensils incorrectly. So, you persist in quiet, and you anticipate your opportunity to cease cleaning and begin to count. Now that you've perfected the delicate craft of transporting tea and fading into the background, it's time to advance your abilities. No, not yet to dancing or musical tools. Don't rush ahead. Initially, you must master remaining seated for extended periods without squirming or inhaling too vigorously. Welcome to posture instruction, the time-honored, esteemed Japanese custom of folding your legs into knots and aligning your spine like reed. You position yourself in seiza, the proper kneeling stance where your limbs are tucked neatly below you, your posture is erect and your blood flow subtly surrenders. Initially, your limbs numb after 3 minutes, then they murmur warnings. After 10, your entire lower half has formally rebelled, but you're forbidden to adjust, extend, or cry out because geisha embody elegance. They do not grimace, they do not fidget. They withstand discomfort as if it's a stylistic preference. You also start bowing repeatedly. There are numerous bowing methods, each with nuanced differences. A welcome bow, a thanks bow, a regret bow, a please spare me for being bow. You learn to incline your head to exactly the correct degree, maintain it for precisely the right duration, and ascend with a fluidity typically seen in fine parchment unfurling in a gentle wind. Naturally, you'll err. All do. You'll bow too hastily or too superficially, or, worst of all, graze the ground with your fingertips at the improper, precise slant. Someone will chastise you with the mild fervor of a saddened spirit. You also practice seating during tea rituals. Your knees must stay bent even when your spirit yearns to flee your form. You must shift as if submerged, gradual, smooth, intentional. If you sneeze, well done. You've just shamed your forebears. But amid the spasms and inner turmoil, a transformation occurs. You begin to carry your head taller. Your actions grow quieter, more purposeful. You evolve from youngster to silhouette. This is where comprehension dawns. Geisha preparation isn't about dramatics. It's about mastery over your tone, over your physique, over how society perceives you. You're discovering how to disappear with beauty. Following years of surface cleaning, leg agony, and cultivating the stance of a modest figure, you at last hear the phrases you've yearned for. You're prepared to advance to Maiko. It's akin to being informed you've advanced from phantom to decorative individual. Well done. You are now a Maiko, a trainee geisha, which means, paradoxically, the genuine hardship is only commencing. First, the coiffure. Your scalp will now become a dynamic artwork. Expert stylists appear with resin, wax, fasteners, and an unsettling composure. They coil your locks into the classic Nihongami form, a lofty, intricate setup that requires hours to assemble and roughly one ill-timed sniffle to ruin. And you can't recline to sleep anymore. No. You must employ a takamakura, a timber neck support crafted to elevate your head so your valuable hairstyle avoids contact with anything, particularly logic. Resting in this manner tests resolve and cervical fortitude. You adapt to it, somewhat, in time, perhaps. Now, the attire. Your fresh kimono is an adorned heavyweight. It's stunning, burdensome, and created by someone who evidently disliked shoulders. The arms are lengthy enough to brush a modest plot. The obi belt is fastened in a detailed bow that perches midway on your back and weighs roughly as much as a young child. Dressing daily demands assistance, frequently from 2 or 3 others who have committed to memory the venerable technique of encasing cloth around a person until it's 75% garment and 25% remorse. Then there are the kanzashi, your hair decorations. These are lovely, thematic, and pointed enough to serve as minor armaments. You don them like a tiara, but they also announce your status and progress level. One misplaced pin, and all in the chamber know you've perpetrated a style offense warrantable by embarrassment. As a Maiko, your duty is to observe, mimic, and sporadically offer tea while attired like a living floral display. You're not permitted to converse too openly, chuckle too boisterously, or, forbid it, pose inquiries. You are artwork, not opinion. But amid the unease, the throbbing head, and the incapacity to sneeze near open flames, you sense something more. You're no longer overlooked. Individuals take note of you, and not solely because your ensemble is noticeable from space. There's no singular epiphany where you arise and reflect, indeed, I am now a true trainee geisha. It's more a gradual ritualistic elevation encased in fabric, fragrance, and mild tension. But the formal day you debut is a Maiko that's distinct. That occasion arrives with formality and strain. Envision it as the Edo-era equivalent of a coming-out event, except rather than waltzing and beverages, there's kneeling, perspiring, and at least 2 complete hours of hair arrangement with heated wax. You've prepared for years, bowed more than a devotional icon, and learned the intricate method to dispense tea without appearing to dispense tea. Now, at last, you present your visage, whitened naturally, to Kyoto's upper class, and they evaluate you courteously, keenly, quietly, with collapsible fans. You adorn your most ornate kimono to date, strata of bright silk costing more than your original family's abode. It's so extended, it trails behind you like a costly misjudgment. Your obi is secured in the dorari manner, a lengthy dangling belt that proclaims, "Yes, I'm novice here. Kindly appreciate my endurance." Your countenance is completely coated now. Pale rice dust from brow to collar, crimson and ebony highlights on your eyelids, lips shaped in an ideal arc, though initially only the lower one, because evidently novice grace is a partial lip affair. You traverse the lanes in your okobo, those elevated clogs that function as archaic torment implements, while all gaze turns to you. Not because you're renowned, but because you're a fresh Maiko, and it's an uncommon spectacle. Also, you're proceeding very, very gradually. It's the sole pace feasible. Then arrives your misadashi, your official introduction rite. You encounter patrons initially, salute benefactors, and exhibit for seniors who recall when their next functioned properly. Each stride, grin, and swallow of tea is an examination, and misstep isn't met with shouts. It's met with letdown, which is graver. But somehow you persist. You navigate the ceremony, the display, the procession. You don't stumble, spill, or insult a notable. In geisha terms, this is a tremendous success, and abruptly, you're formally a Maiko. Part youth, part ceramic emblem, full-time artistic exhibit. Being a Maiko entails numerous duties: dispensing tea, performing dances, feigning ignorance of unsettling hints. But none rival your most hallowed routine, the visage. Your cosmetic application is now a comprehensive tactical endeavor. Step 1. Apply a dense layer of pale rice dust to your face, neck, and torso, which aromas like slate, textures like adhesive, and somehow infiltrates your being. It solidifies quicker than your vitality and hardens like stucco. Once applied, you're no longer mortal. You're a blank slate. Step 2. Brows. Yours vanished, concealed beneath dust, fresh ones sketched with soot, slender, shadowy, and solemn like they harbor a mystery. Step 3. Eyelids. You outline your rims with a blend of scarlet and ebony color, delicately administered with a brush so fine it could adorn grains of rice. One spasm and you've shifted from refined trainee to spectral bandit. And then the lips. As a novice Maiko, you're permitted only the lower lip. Why? Custom. Also something indistinct about humility and not becoming overly conceited. You color it scarlet, meticulously formed like a small bow. It's deemed lovely. It also renders dining resemble an elaborate exhibit. Errors are unacceptable. Blur your lip. Recommence. Uneven outline, intolerable. Outline isn't invented yet. You're utilizing ground minerals blended with saliva and hopelessness. Once complete, you gaze in the reflection and behold something both archaic and intimidating. A figurine, a luminous, pale, delicate, exquisite figurine with the inner vigor of a performer and the daily nourishment of a rodent. But here's the essence. Under the facade, you're emerging authority. This appearance demands notice. It declares, I'm heritage enveloped in spectacle, and I will critique your awkward utensil handling. The cosmetics aren't for conceit, they're for protection. It distinguishes you from common females. It informs all that you're present to enact, not engage. It also informs your pores that they're superfluous. Hope you weren't overly fond of dermal respiration. You don't apply this facade for yourself. You apply it so others overlook you're merely 15 and commence regarding you as artwork. At initial view, you might assume the geisha's primary instruments are her allure, her kimono, or conceivably the keen metal hairspike she maintains solely for ornamental reasons. But you'd be mistaken. Her true armaments are dual, the shamisen and the venerable Japanese craft of making uncomfortable gentlemen feel captivating. You study the shamisen, a trio-stringed device that resembles an armed ladle and resonates like a sorrowful banjo. Mastering it demands elegance, tempo, and digits that don't seize like preserved cephalopod. You rehearse for hours each day, generating sounds that commence as distressed feline and progressively advance to credible setting. Your instructors are unrelenting. One omitted tone garners an exhale. 2 omitted tones garners an arched brow. 3 omitted tones, and you're dispatched to adjust the device until it resonates less like a culinary mishap. But melody is merely half the formula. The other half, dialogue. You're not simply acquiring speech, you're acquiring how to converse indirectly, how to praise without falsehood, how to imply without committing, how to maintain a gentleman involved in discussion without him realizing you're internally planning tomorrow's choreography while nodding courteously. You hone nuance like it's a combat discipline. If a patron notes he's affluent, you grin mildly and shift the subject to the lunar orb. If he attempts overt courtship, you laud his preference in footwear and proffer additional sock. You are the sovereign of refined redirection. And, oh, the verse, you commit to memory multitudes of odes about blossoms, streams, and sorrow. You can cite Basho while serving tea and still possess sufficient capacity to observe who's overindulged, all while maintaining your posture upright and your timbre one register above your inner outcry. By this point, you've grasped that being a Maiko isn't about amusement. It's about regulating feelings. yours, your patrons, the chambers. You discern atmospheres quicker than you discern words. You know when to chortle, when to hesitate, and when to act as if you missed something appalling. This is your fresh existence, part musician, part counselor, all enactment. And the alarming aspect, you're becoming truly proficient at it. Ah, indeed. The dana. The term resonates refined, somewhat enigmatic, and just courteous enough to conceal what it truly signifies. A prosperous male sponsor who bolsters your profession with threads of duty interlaced so firmly they could serve as a snare. You learn of the notion early. A dana, they explain, is the esteemed gentleman who values the arts, finances your education, and assists with the lavish expenses of kimono, hair adornments, and basic sustenance. In exchange, you're anticipated to accompany him, make him feel significant, and ideally not flee shrieking into the darkness. It's not amorous. This isn't a Jane Austen tale. This is a commercial deal clad in silk. You don't select your dana. The resident selects. Your okasan evaluates standing, riches, and societal ties like a connoisseur detecting matured vulnerability. You, in turn, are instructed to grin and feign that the gentleman before you, who is 40 years your elder and inhales like a weary bovine, is enthralling. Now, to clarify, not every dana anticipates specific privileges. Some are authentic supporters of the arts who merely relish the companionship of a skilled, intelligent woman who can converse on poetry and governance without tears or disruption. Others are not. The limits are ambiguous, culturally implicit, and the strain is enormous. You are indebted to your residents, you are indebted to your prospects. You are indebted to your knees, which are presently aching beneath another 10 pounds of material. And so, you master the craft of sentimental equilibrium. You maintain matters light, amicable, deferential. You become an expert at making men feel cherished while safeguarding your essence behind a grin. If sentimental effort were accessible, you'd impoverish the shogunate. Occasionally, it succeeds. A dana might back you for years, protecting you from monetary collapse and offering just sufficient separation to render it tolerable. Other times, you cultivate the enduring skill to detach in the moment while nodding at a narrative about crop levies for the 15th occasion. In any case, the framework isn't about affection. It's about advantage. And the sole method to endure it is to learn how to tip the scales back toward yourself, all while donning 3 strata of brocade and acting as if the chamber isn't ablaze. One day, someone presents you a pair of footwear that resemble miniature structures and says, "Don these." They're termed okobo, elevated platform clogs crafted from solid timber with no justification for being. Designed not for ease, but for ritual, sophistication, and possibly reprisal. These clogs are worn solely by Maiko, which means if you're in them, you're now expected to drift, not stroll, across Kyoto's avenues without teetering, stumbling, or erupting in sobs. The okobo elevate you, make you more stately, less ordinary. You no longer ambulate like a human. You skim like a temple march. The aim is to proceed with such poise that no one notices you're actually battling for survival with each pace. They lack padding, of course they do. This is Edo, Japan. Your feet pulse, your calves wail, your equilibrium becomes a constant occupation. Heaven assist you if it's precipitating. Slick okobo on cobblestone paths transform every excursion to a tea house into an elite athletic challenge. The noise they produce, a distinct clack-clack, is intentional. When a Maiko proceeds down the avenue, people recognize that rhythmic tap as your new accompaniment. It's lovely, It's customary. It also alerts everyone within 5 blocks to your location at all times. Discretion underrated. In time, your limbs adapt. Somewhat. You build sinews in your ankles you didn't know were there. You learn to tumble with dignity. You refine the craft of navigating turns gradually, elegantly, and with just the proper measure of dramatic foot positioning. And just when you believe you've conquered it, someone appends a 12-pound obi to your midsection and dispatches you to a patron supper with 3 staircases. Wearing okobo is a passage rite. It's also a public cue that you're still a trainee. Full geisha don flatter footwear because by then they've merited the privilege to not endure so evidently. You're still meriting it one wooden thud at a time. Let's clarify one thing. A geisha is a performer. You enact, you dance, you vocalize, you dispense sack with refinement and allure so subtle it could masquerade as climate. You are a mobile masterpiece whose strength resides in moderation. You utter just enough. You disclose just enough. You dwell in the revered gap between esteem and separation. A courtesan, or oiran, is the elite companion schooled in the craft of delight. Their role involves strata of enactment too, but with one key distinction. Theirs typically concludes in a chamber. Yours concludes with acclaim, a boo, and aching souls. The aesthetic mix-up doesn't aid. Both don ornate kimono, both don elaborate hairstyles. But here's your quick guide. If the obi is fastened in front, she's a courtesan, easy reach. If it's fastened in back, she's a geisha, delayed departure, you're welcome. But none of that signifies when you're in a space full of gentlemen who viewed one poor film and think geisha is synonym for exotic summons. So you cultivate a talent, the craft of courteously amending someone while making them feel like they enlightened you. It's verbal aikido. You utter things like, "Ah, how generous of you to inquire. Our customs are quite distinct from that." Grin, sip, redirect, iterate. You'll deliver this same clarification 100 times in your profession. It will never cease being essential. But each time you do it with poise, you reaffirm the boundary, one fluid phrase at a time. Because being a geisha means never forfeiting your composure, even when someone confuses you for something you're not. Again, as a Maiko and ultimately a geisha, you are expected to excel in melody, movement, decorum, and the subtle ability of appearing thrilled while hearing a gentleman discuss grain duties for 2 hours. But your most practical and least instructed talent, declining without ever employing the word no. See, you can't outright rebuff someone. That would be discourteous and worse, unrefined. No one compensates a geisha to be direct. Your worth lies in nuance, in implication, in the capacity to veer from a suggestion like a moth in elevated clogs. Suppose a patron grows audacious. Perhaps he inclines too near, praises your gaze too frequently, or utters the timeless, "Maybe we could convene somewhere more secluded." You don't strike him, you don't exclaim. That's novice level. Instead, you grin, incline your head, and say something like, "Ah, you must be quite favored by ladies." This phrase has precisely 0 content, but it compliments him, redirects the exchange, and grants you 10 seconds to replenish his vessel and act as if that never transpired. Another timeless, "Oh, what a pity, I'm dreadfully occupied that day." This functions even when he hasn't designated a day. You are perpetually dreadfully occupied because a geisha's agenda is an enigma wrapped in silk and believable evasion. Or you utilize the classic mirth. Just a mild entertained titter, followed by a soft head shake and a topic shift. It's a ballet, one where you direct and they never quite perceive it. Over time, you become proficient in the tongue of evasion. You can rebuff someone thrice consecutively while making them feel like they're the esteemed guest. It's draining, yes, but it's an art form, one transmitted from woman to woman like a covert grimoire inscribed in fan gestures and indirect courteousness. Because here's the reality. A geisha's role isn't to gratify longing, it's to oversee it, to direct it, to render the space feel enchanting while keeping both hands on the reins. And if all else falters, grin, bow, and say, "Such a captivating notion." That usually suffices. The okiya may appear tranquil, with paper partitions, dim illumination, the soft twang of shamisen drifting through the atmosphere. But don't be deceived. It's a combat zone, not one with blades or yells. No, geisha conflicts are subtler, keener, like being gradually eliminated with accolades. Every geisha residence is a meticulously regulated ecosystem, and within it thrives a concealed forest of order, competition, and minor retribution delivered in silk. You're encircled by women who are astute, ambitious, and trained to grin through overt conflict. Did someone take your obi without permission? Oh, how considerate. Did another Maiko show up to supper with the identical thematic hairpin? How fortuitous. Did your shamisen performance suddenly get reassigned to someone else at the last moment? Merely a mix-up, the sort that somehow always advantages the more favored girl. You learn swiftly. Not all grins are benevolent, not all praises are genuine, and never leave your cosmetics unattended. There's a protocol, naturally. You don't shriek or strike. That's for the untrained. Here, vengeance is served with composure. One additional syllable in a haiku, one erroneous step noted politely during rehearsal. A subtle murmur to a patron that perhaps, just perhaps, you overheard something intriguing about that other Maiko's conduct at the prior tea ritual. Gossip in the okiya propagates faster than flames on a paper lamp. You attempt to remain aloof naturally, but eventually you'll be drawn in. Maybe you're the new preferred. Maybe your performance was too outstanding. Maybe someone's simply irritable and suddenly your clogs are absent. Coincidence? Certainly. You endure by learning to be gracious tactically. You master the craft of complimenting someone while suggesting the contrary. Your new kimono is so daring. I could never don something so bold. Eventually, you'll ascend above it, literally. As a full geisha, you'll surpass the trainees and acquire your own chamber, your own patrons, and fewer accidental stains on your attire. But until then, welcome to fan conflicts. They're mute. They're merciless, and they're waged with poise, timing, and an occasional well-timed brow lift. You don't require armor here. You need a reflection, a recollection, and the ability to say thank you like it's a caution. After years of kneeling, bowing, grinning, and resisting the impulse to cry into your obi, the day comes. You are no longer a Maiko. You are now a geisha. The change is subtle. No grand march, no celebratory pyrotechnics. You simply awaken one day, and instead of being the girl in preparation, you are the benchmark everyone else is preparing toward. And oddly, your knees still ache. Your wardrobe alters. Gone are the brightly hued, long-sleeved Maiko kimono that made you resemble a mobile floral display. Your new style is more restrained, more sophisticated, like you've finally earned the right to attire yourself as someone with views. Your hair, praise the deities. It's no longer a weekly construct from wax and determination. You now don a wig. Yes, a wig. It's heavier than your head and still requires half a salon and a wonder to arrange. But at least you can rest like an ordinary person again, which is to say inadequately and on a futon. But the largest change, you now perform solo. You don't trail anymore. You guide. You're expected to host, amuse, and enchant without aid. Your shamisen pieces are extended, your dialogues are sharper. You must be serene, composed, and above all, commanding. Patrons no longer view you as endearing, they view you as influential, not in a blade-brandishing, fortress-raising way, but in the way that a single arched brow can derail a whole conversation. You've mastered nuance, you've armed grace. People heed when you speak, or rather, when you choose to speak, because geisha know the true craft of power, silence employed judiciously. And with this new rank come new loads. You must guide the younger Maiko. You must grin at patrons you've grinned at 1,000 times. You must bear the burden of heritage, of anticipation, of millennia of cultural enactment. But deep within, something's altered now. You're no longer simulating. You've become the individual the okiya molded you into. Not just a woman in a kimono, but a living emblem of Polish enigma and flawlessly measured sentimental labor. You are no longer in preparation. You are the heritage. So you've endured. You've danced, served tea, grinned through eras of custom, and evaded stumbling in okubo long enough to reach the unspoken segment in every geisha narrative. What next? Because here's the secret no one reveals to you. Geisha don't really retire. Not in the conventional sense. There's no rite where someone presents you a golden fan and a gratitude note. You don't receive a stipend. You just gradually recede from the focus like a taper consumed to the base. Some geisha shift into educators. You become the one adjusting someone's bow angle with a single glance. You exhibit the shamisen for the 100th time, knowing full well the Maiko before you is pondering lunch. You've become the heritage, the living evidence that elegance ages gracefully and outlasts trends. Others become housemaiders, the okasan. Yes, her. The woman who once appraised your bow like it was a felony. And now it's you, positioned by the sliding panel, examining the new shikomi with the look of someone pondering if the rice vessel is scorching. You manage the residents, you establish the guidelines, and you determine who advances and who polishes the entrance again until they learn how to proceed without resembling a herd. Some geisha wed discreetly, tactically, perhaps even to a former dana who's still respiring and has the decency not to inquire about costs. You exchange one form of enactment for another, the craft of grinning through household life, but many geishas simply persist, slower, quieter, but still keen. You host more personal assemblies. You become less about enactment and more about existence. You utter less, but it carries more. Your nod can alter the ambiance of a space. Your absence becomes evident. There's no magnificent departure, no final ovation. You just transition into obscurity, still enveloped in silk, still moving like a verse with ankles. And even when your public showings become infrequent, your name endures, transmitted by younger geisha who still rehearse the motions you refined long ago. By now your knees are eternally formed like tatami mats. Your back aligns instinctively. Your voice, always melodic, holds significance, not because it's boisterous, but because it seldom needs to be. You are no longer just a geisha. You are recollection rendered visible. You won't find your name etched in rock or printed in volumes. You won't go viral. There's no trending clip of you serving tea with precise elegance or reciting waka poetry between shamisen chords. But your heritage isn't the kind that requires volume. It resides in the next girl, kneeling too long on sore legs, trying not to blur her lip color as she perfects a half grin that conceals fatigue and exudes charm. It resides in the way the fan unfolds, crisp, exact, and silent. A gesture older than most realms. It resides in the quiet intervals between words at a gathering, where your presence still shifts the environment even if no one recalls your debut date or the name of the patron who purchased your first seasonal comb. Your role was never to be loud. It was to be unforgettable in ways most people wouldn't know how to articulate, to enthrall, not entice, to suggest, not proclaim, to turn a supper into a rite and a glance into a declaration. And through it all, you endured. You endured the preparation, the weight of custom, the footwear that tried to end you. You endured assumptions, a rivalry, the patrons who mistook enactment for consent, and the gossip that never dissipated as quickly as it was concocted. But most of all, you endured elegantly in a world that demanded flawlessness and quiet. You created space for self-possession. You carved out a life that was both enactment and defiance, all while never elevating your voice. And maybe no one will utter your name aloud when they recount the story of Kyoto, but someone will sip tea just so. Someone will walk in kimono without rustling. Someone will grin with an inscrutable gaze and say, "Just enough and not a word more." And in that instant, you'll still be there. Not as a spirit, but as heritage. Forget candlelit suppers or moonlight melodies. In ancient Sumer, the cradle of civilization, marriage was less about romance and more about documentation. Love was optional. Contracts were mandatory. Sumerians, who lived over 4,000 years ago in what is now southern Iraq, were the first people we know of to formalize marriage with written agreements. And by written, we mean impressed into wet clay using a stylus. These were not declarations of eternal affection. They were binding economic transactions. The cuneiform tablet often spelled out exactly what each party was bringing into the union. And no, unconditional love was never one of the listed assets. The bride came with a dowry, livestock, textiles, servants, or land. The groom's family might toss in a bride price, which was less a gesture of goodwill and more of a deposit. If the marriage failed, the tablet made it clear what was forfeited, refunded, or repossessed. Yes, Sumerian marriages came with early versions of prenups. Your love life could be audited. But the Sumerians didn't stop at cold transactions. Marriage was a cornerstone of maintaining social order. Women were expected to be loyal and fertile. Men were expected to provide and protect, or at least not embarrass the family at public rituals. Infidelity, especially by the wife, could be punished harshly, including death by drowning. Divorce was allowed, but only if you could prove just cause. We grew apart wouldn't cut it. Weddings themselves were modest affairs, no Instagram-worthy decor or white veils. The couple would move in together and perform rituals, possibly invoking deities like Inanna or Enlil. But the real marriage began when the community recognized the union and the contract was filed like an ancient tax return. The Sumerians viewed marriage less as a personal journey and more as a civil duty. Your union was a cog in the machinery of inheritance, agriculture, and divine order. Your spouse, a partner in social strategy, a teammate in a world where surviving floods and feeding goats took precedence over candlelit poetry. In ancient Egypt, marriage wasn't just sanctioned by society. It was mirrored in the heavens. The gods themselves were married, Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb. Even chaos had a soulmate. Egyptians believed that divine pairs maintained cosmic balance, and human marriages were expected to do the same. That's a lot of pressure for a couple trying to keep the household cats from eating the sacred grain. Marriage was seen as the ideal social state. A man was expected to marry young, ideally before he could do too much damage as a bachelor. Women married in their early teens, and while love may not have been the focus, companionship and affection were valued. Egyptian love poetry was surprisingly tender. One poem reads, My heart flutters hastily when I think of you. Another says, she has stolen my heart with her hair. Not exactly Tinder bios, but it's something. Legal documents were often involved, especially among the upper class. Like the Sumerians, the Egyptians used contracts with clear stipulations about property, dowries, and divorce terms. But unlike Sumer, Egyptian women had notable legal rights. They could own property, initiate divorce, and sue their husbands for neglect. Queen or not, an Egyptian woman could drag her husband to court if he failed to provide bread, beer, or, crucially, oil. Incestuous marriage was another curiosity, especially among royals. Pharaohs routinely married their sisters. And no, it wasn't because of a limited dating pool. The reason? To emulate the gods. Just as Isis married her brother Osiris, a royal union between siblings was believed to preserve divine bloodlines. Sacred genes along with a side of genetic risk. Wedding ceremonies themselves weren't elaborate. There was no priestly blessing or public spectacle. A couple was considered married once they moved in together and cohabited. That's it. No doves, no cake, and certainly no throwing of bouquets. The gods didn't need fanfare to approve. Children were the central goal of marriage, not love, not partnership, not personal fulfillment, just heirs. The more the better. If your wife couldn't conceive, you might take a concubine or marry a second woman. Love, optional. Lineage, essential. In most ancient cultures, marriage was a family affair. In Sparta, it was a military operation. If Sumerian marriage was a business deal and Egyptian marriage a divine mimicry, then Spartan marriage was a survival tactic wrapped in state propaganda and six-pack abs. Here's how it worked. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and tossed into the agage, the brutal training system designed to produce elite warriors who could kill with a spoon and eat raw roots without flinching. Girls, meanwhile, were trained too, in wrestling, javelin throwing, and sarcastic one-liners. The idea wasn't just strength for strength's sake. It was about producing healthy offspring. A weak child was a liability. A strong child was a future Spartan. So marriage wasn't about candlelight or meeting the one. It was state-mandated breeding. The state even scheduled the ideal marriage age, around 30 for men, early teens for women. Romantic? No. The wedding ceremony was as strange as you'd expect from people who thought iron bars made good currency. Here's how it went. The bride's head was shaved and she was dressed in a man's cloak and sandals. Then she was left alone in a dark room. The groom would sneak in at night, consummate the marriage, and then sneak back out before sunrise, returning to his all-male barracks. Yes, even after marriage, Spartan men didn't live with their wives. The relationship was built on secrecy and quick visits, like ancient Tinder with a curfew. Why all the cloak and dagger? The idea was to keep desire alive. Too much familiarity might make men soft, and softness had no place in Sparta. The mystery kept the spark going, or so the logic went, though modern therapists might have questions. Despite the odd rituals, Spartan women had more power than most ancient counterparts. They could own land, run estates, and insult men in public without being executed. Love poems weren't popular, but wit was. Spartan women were famously sharp-tongued. One told her husband, "Come back with your shield or on it." That's basically the ancient Greek version of "don't embarrass me." In ancient India, marriage was more than a personal union. It was a sacred duty, a spiritual journey governed by dharma, the cosmic law. Rooted in the Vedic tradition, marriage was considered one of the key rites of passage, the samskara, necessary for fulfilling one's responsibilities to family, ancestors, and society. Marriage was not entered into lightly. It wasn't merely a contract between two individuals, but a bond between two families, two lineages, and sometimes two entire villages. It was meant to uphold Varna Dharma, the social and moral order, ensuring stability through caste alignment, ritual propriety, and mutual obligation. Arranged marriages were the norm, and horoscopes played a central role in matching partners. Astrologers examined the alignment of stars and planets to determine compatibility. The idea was that cosmic harmony would lead to earthly peace. A good match was believed to bring prosperity not just to the couple, but to the entire household. The wedding ceremony was a complex symbolic ritual centered around Agni, the sacred fire. The couple would walk 7 steps, the Saptapadi, around the fire, taking vows at each step, to nourish one another, to grow in strength, to share in wealth, to be righteous, to raise strong children, to enjoy the seasons of life together, and to remain lifelong companions. With these steps, the two were considered spiritually united. The wife, known as Saha Dharma Patni, was expected to be both a partner and a moral guide. She managed the household, performed religious duties, and was central to preserving the family's ritual purity. Her role, though domestic, was seen as spiritually vital. The husband was expected to protect, provide, and uphold Dharma through his own conduct. Polygamy existed, especially among the elite, but monogamy was considered ideal. Widows were expected to lead a life of austerity, although practices varied over time and region. The controversial custom of sati, where a widow self-immolated on her husband's pyre, was rare in ancient times and emerged much later, largely outside Vedic ideals. In ancient China, marriage was not a private affair. It was a deeply structured institution rooted in Confucian principles, ancestral worship, and family hierarchy. To marry was not simply to fall in love or to raise a family. It was to honor the past and secure the future under the ever-watchful eyes of both the living and the dead. The primary purpose of marriage was continuity of the family line. Filial piety, xiao, demanded that a son marry and produce male heirs to maintain ancestral rights. If a man failed to do so, he not only disappointed his parents, but risked disrupting the family's spiritual duties. Ancestors had to be fed and honored. A childless home was a broken chain in the lineage, a cause for shame and cosmic imbalance. Marriage decisions were never made by the young couple. Families employed matchmakers who negotiated the terms, inspected backgrounds, and consulted astrological charts. A marriage without proper celestial alignment was considered risky. Compatibility wasn't about chemistry, but about heavenly timing and earthly duty. The 6 rites of traditional Chinese marriage reflected this ceremonial complexity. It began with a proposal, then name exchange, divination, betrothal gifts, setting the date, and finally the ceremony itself. Each step involved rituals, symbolism, and precise communication between families, a process that could take months, even years. On the wedding day, the bride wore red, the color of joy and luck, and traveled in a decorated sedan chair to the groom's house. She was veiled, silent, and ceremonially passive. Upon arrival, the couple bowed 3 times, to heaven and earth, to the parents, and finally to each other. These bows signified the order of loyalty: cosmos first, then family, then self. Once married, the wife entered her husband's household and was expected to obey his parents as her own. Her duty was to bear sons, manage domestic affairs, and serve quietly. While some women gained respect with age or motherhood, their position remained within a clearly defined patriarchal framework. Divorce was rare and shameful. A man could dismiss his wife for disobedience or infertility, but a woman had no such right. The marriage bond, though revered, was unbalanced in power. In ancient Japan, marriage was shaped not by centralized law or religious doctrine, but by centuries of evolving customs, regional traditions, and a profound reverence for nature and ancestors. Rooted in Shinto beliefs, the indigenous spirituality of Japan, marriage was less about formal contracts and more about purity, harmony, and social cohesion. Shintoism teaches that kami, divine spirits, inhabit all things, rivers, trees, mountains, and even people. A harmonious marriage, therefore, was seen as aligning oneself with the natural order. Purity and ritual cleanliness were essential in every major rite of passage, and marriage was no exception. In early periods, marriages were arranged by families, not romantic partners. The goals were practical: alliance building, land consolidation, and continuation of the household line, especially in elite families. However, compared to neighboring cultures, Japan afforded women a relatively higher status. In ancient times, women could inherit property, manage estates, and wield influence within the household. The typical marriage followed a process known as mukoiri, or groom entering the bride's household. In this custom, the groom moved into the bride's family home, a reversal of the more common patrilocal traditions elsewhere in Asia. This reflected the importance of matrilineal continuity in some regions, especially among powerful families. Over time, however, this gave way to yomeri, where the bride joined the groom's household, a shift that aligned with growing patriarchal norms. Shinto wedding rituals focused on purification and reverence. The couple would participate in a sansan kudo ceremony, drinking sake in 3 sips from 3 cups. Each sip represented a bond between the individuals, between their families, and between their spirits. There were no vows in the Western sense, but the symbolism spoke of unity and mutual respect. Unlike rigid legal systems in other cultures, early Japanese marriage customs were flexible. Polygamy was practiced among elites, but not institutionalized. Divorce, while frowned upon, was possible, especially in cases of infertility or incompatibility. However, public harmony and family honor were always prioritized. The act of separating had to be handled with discretion. In ancient Rome, marriage was not simply a personal milestone. It was a civic institution intertwined with law, class, and public duty. Romans treated marriage as a reflection of the social order, where alliances were forged, property was transferred, and lineage was preserved under the watchful gaze of the state and the paterfamilias, the male head of the household. Marriage in Rome was categorized into different legal forms. The most traditional was cum manu, where the wife left her family and came under the legal authority, or manus, of her husband or his father. She was no longer legally part of her natal family and became akin to a daughter in her husband's household. Her property became his. This form, however, gradually faded in favor of sin manu, in which the wife remained under the authority of her father and retained greater legal independence. This shift reflected evolving attitudes and the increasing economic power of elite Roman women. Marriage ceremonies were marked by ritual and symbolism. The bride wore a flame-colored veil called the flammeum, and her hair was parted into 6 locks with a spear, a nod to tradition and the martial roots of Roman culture. The joining of hands, dextrarum junctio, symbolized the union, and offerings were made to household gods, especially Juno, the goddess of marriage. A formal procession led the bride to her new home, where she was welcomed with fire and water, emblems of purity and life. For Roman elites, marriage was a political tool. Senators and nobles used marriages to cement alliances and secure influence. Personal affection, while not irrelevant, was often secondary. Even emperors arranged marriages for political leverage, frequently disregarding their own preferences. Women in Roman marriages were expected to be modest, loyal, and dedicated to running the household. However, Roman women, especially under sine manu marriages, could own property, inherit wealth, and even initiate divorce. Divorce was common and socially acceptable, provided it was handled with dignity. "Where you are, goes I am," the bride would once vow. But if things soured, parting ways was often as swift as declaring intent before witnesses. For the ancient Hebrews, marriage was not just a social contract, it was a sacred covenant guided by divine law. Rooted in the traditions of the Hebrew Bible, marriage was a cornerstone of religious life, lineage, and moral order. It was a relationship that reflected not only human connection, but also the enduring bond between the people of Israel and their God. Marriage was viewed as essential to fulfilling the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. It was expected of all men, and early marriage was the norm. Love, while valued, was not the foundation. Obedience to God and duty to family took precedence. A proper marriage preserved tribal identity, secured inheritance rights, and maintained the purity of the community. Arranged marriages were standard, negotiated between families with a focus on kinship ties, reputation, and property. A bride price, the mohar, was paid by the groom to the bride's family, not as a purchase, but as a formal gesture of commitment and compensation. Women often married in their early teens while men were slightly older, having established the means to support a household. Ceremonies were domestic affairs, often taking place in the bride's home and followed by a celebratory feast. The rituals emphasized joy, continuity, and blessings, with wine, singing, and the reading of sacred texts. A written ketubah, marriage contract, outlined the husband's responsibilities to provide food, clothing, and conjugal rights. It also protected the wife's financial interests in case of divorce or widowhood. Though patriarchy defined much of Hebrew society, women held an honored position within the family structure. The woman of valor, described in Proverbs, was wise, industrious, and respected. While polygamy existed, especially among early patriarchs like Abraham and Jacob, monogamy became more common over time, particularly after the Babylonian exile. Divorce was permitted, but discouraged. A man could issue a get, a writ of divorce, under certain conditions. However, this process required religious approval and was subject to legal limitations, ensuring that the woman was not left vulnerable or dishonored. Among the ancient Celts, marriage was a deeply communal and symbolic act woven into the rhythms of the natural world, tribal allegiance, and ancestral law. It was less a static institution and more a fluid, adaptable bond shaped by personal choice, social duty, and seasonal rituals. Unlike the rigid legal codes of Rome or the cosmic obligations of India, Celtic marriage customs varied widely across tribes and regions, from Ireland to Gaul to the Scottish Highlands. Yet, some common threads endured: partnership, fertility, and honor. The Celts viewed marriage as a sacred oath, often sworn in the presence of tribal elders, druids, and the ever-present gods of land and sky. Marriage could be monogamous or polygynous, depending on wealth and status. Among nobles and chieftains, it was not uncommon for a man to have multiple wives, each with her own household standing. However, This was governed by clear expectations and mutual agreement. Women were not passive figures. Celtic women often had legal rights, including property ownership, divorce, and even the ability to initiate marriage. One striking feature of Celtic union was the trial marriage, a year-and-a-day arrangement where couples could live together before deciding whether to continue the relationship permanently. If either partner was dissatisfied, they could walk away without stigma. This custom, far ahead of its time, emphasized consent and compatibility over permanence for its own sake. Ceremonies often coincided with seasonal festivals like Beltane, a fire rite marking the beginning of summer and fertility. Couples would leap over flames or pass between bonfires to symbolize purification and union. These rites were believed to bless the marriage with strength, fruitfulness, and harmony with nature. Marriage contracts, especially among elites, were formalized and could include clauses about dowries, shared property, and inheritance. Unlike many ancient societies, Celtic law recognized mutual responsibilities between spouses. Abuse or neglect could be grounds for dissolution, and women had recourse in tribal courts. The spiritual dimension of Celtic marriage was ever present. Vows were not just personal. They were bound to the earth, the tribe, and the gods. The couple's union was a thread in the larger tapestry of land and lineage, and their fidelity was a promise not only to each other, but to the sacred balance that held the world together. The origins of Malbork Castle lie not in the misty forests of Poland, but in the searing heat of the Holy Land. During the late 12th century, the Teutonic Order was born amidst the chaos of the Third Crusade. Originally formed in 1190 as a group of German crusaders caring for wounded Christian soldiers in Acre, the order soon transformed into a full-fledged military monastic force, part nurse, part knight, and wholly devoted to the expansion of Christendom. But the Holy Land was slipping away. As Muslim armies under Saladin reclaimed territory and European powers lost interest, the Teutonic Knights found themselves without a clear purpose. Their zeal remained, but the battleground would shift. In 1226, the Polish Duke Conrad of Mazovia saw an opportunity. Plagued by raids from pagan Prussian tribes to the north, he invited the knights into his lands, offering them territory in exchange for protection and conversion of the Baltic peoples. The Teutonic Knights agreed, but they had ambitions far beyond missionary work. With papal backing and imperial approval, they began carving out their own theocratic state. In this war-torn frontier, the sword would spread the cross. Brick by brick, they laid the foundation of a new stronghold to anchor their rule. Marienburg, later known as Malbork Mary's Castle, named in honor of the Virgin Mary, patroness of the order. Construction began in 1274, and from the start, it was meant to awe. This was not merely a fortress, it was a declaration. Built in the distinctive red Gothic brick style of northern Europe, it rose from the banks of the Nogat River like a crusader's dream cast in stone. Its walls would not only keep out pagans and rebels, they would proclaim the spiritual and military might of the knights to the entire region. Malbork was more than a castle. It was a base of operations, a monastery, an administrative center, and a symbolic heart of a rising religious empire. The warrior monks were no longer foreign guests, they were rulers now. And this castle, still in its infancy, would one day become the largest fortress in the world by land area, and a bastion of medieval power that still endures. By the late 13th century, Malbork Castle was no longer just a strategic foothold. It was evolving into a monumental expression of power, faith, and architectural ambition. Rising from the flat lands of the Vistula Delta, It stood defiant and unmistakable. A fortress built not of stone, but of brick, the bold material of the north. In an age where most castles clung to limestone and granite, Malbork's red Gothic walls radiated both innovation and intimidation. The Teutonic Knights didn't simply want a stronghold, they wanted a sacred fortress where war and worship could exist side by side. The layout reflected this duality. The complex was built in 3 sections: the high castle, the middle castle, and the lower castle, each walled and fortified, each serving distinct purposes. The high castle, the spiritual core, housed the chapel, the chapter house, and the monks' quarters. This was where the knights lived, prayed, and planned. The architecture was designed with religious symbolism in mind. Narrow windows let in filtered light, casting long shadows on cold stone floors. Vaulted ceilings rose like cathedral arches. Defensive features doubled as spiritual metaphors. Height meant nearness to God. Darkness and light symbolized divine truth against the chaos outside the walls. Malbork wasn't just meant to endure siege, it was meant to inspire awe. The Holy Virgin Church, nestled within the high castle, featured stained glass, intricate tile work, and a statue of the Virgin Mary that towered over the outer walls. Every turret, passageway, and tower was laid out with intent. Nothing was wasted, nothing left to chance. Even the latrines drained cleverly into the Nogat River, a reminder that the knights brought order and cleanliness to a land they viewed as wild and unconverted. As the 14th century dawned, Malbork continued to expand. Craftsmen, laborers, and stonemasons worked year-round. Local peasants were often conscripted to supply food, timber, and manpower. Meanwhile, the fortress became the administrative and spiritual nucleus of the Teutonic Order's growing state. More than just a castle, Malbork was a statement, a brick-and-mortar sermon declaring that the order was here to stay, both as warriors and as monks. It was faith clad in armor, a monastery wrapped in battlements, and it had only just begun to grow. As the 14th century progressed, Malbork Castle was no longer simply a military base. It had become the epicenter of a growing theocratic empire. From this formidable brick bastion, the Teutonic Knights expanded their control across the Baltic, transforming what was once a campaign of conversion into a full-scale colonization of territory, people, and resources. The order operated like a cross between a kingdom and a corporation. Its Grand Master, essentially both Pope and King within the realm, ruled from Malbork with the aid of a strict monastic hierarchy. Beneath him were knights, priests, and lay brothers, all bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet managing vast estates, trade routes, and tax systems. Their goal wasn't only religious, it was territorial consolidation. Forests were cleared, towns were built, paganism was driven underground or destroyed. Malbork was both the symbolic and logistical heart of this effort. Here, the chapter house met to deliberate on policies, elect new grand masters, and decide on matters of war and diplomacy. The castle's fortified treasury guarded gold, silver, and relics, all acquired through tithes, trade, or conquest. Its armories supplied swords and armor for new crusades into Lithuania and beyond. With its influence growing, the order styled itself as a civilizing force. Roads and bridges were constructed. Trade flourished along the Vistula River. German settlers were encouraged to migrate, establishing towns with Gothic cathedrals and markets modeled on the Holy Roman Empire. The region became known not for its pagan past, but for its rigid order under the strict rule of the Black Cross. But with power came enemies. Poland and Lithuania, still largely pagan and fiercely independent, resisted the order's expansion. While some converted willingly, others fought bitterly against forced baptism and foreign control. The borderlands became battlegrounds. Raids were frequent, tensions simmered. Still, from the safety of Malbork's thick walls, the Teutonic Knights seemed invincible. At its height, the Teutonic Order controlled vast stretches of land, stretching from the Baltic Sea deep into Eastern Europe. And at the very center stood Malbork, no longer just a castle, but the capital of a religious state, a monument to faith, power, and imperial ambition. But ambition rarely goes unchallenged. By the dawn of the 15th century, the seemingly unstoppable rise of the Teutonic Order had begun to provoke dangerous resentment. From its brick towers and iron gates, Malbork Castle presided over a domain forged in conquest and enforced through faith. But the knights had made powerful enemies, most notably the newly united kingdoms of Poland and Lithuania. In 1386, a seismic shift occurred. The Grand Duke of Lithuania, Jogaila, converted to Christianity and married the Polish queen, becoming King Władysław II, Jagiełło of Poland. With this union, Lithuania, the last pagan stronghold in Europe, embraced Christianity, removing the order's core justification for its crusade. The ideological ground beneath the Teutonic Knights began to erode. But it wasn't just about religion, it was about land, influence, and revenge. Lithuania had long resisted the order's invasions. Poland had territorial disputes. Now joined by marriage, faith, and politics, the two kingdoms had the strength to confront the knights directly. Tensions turned into border raids. Raids escalated into war. The showdown was inevitable. In 1410 it came. The Battle of Grunwald, also known as the Battle of Tannenberg, saw the combined Polish-Lithuanian army clash with the Teutonic Knights in one of the largest and bloodiest battles of medieval Europe. The knights, heavily armored and confident, were outmaneuvered. Their army was crushed. Their Grand Master, Ulrich von Jungingen, was killed on the field. The defeat sent shockwaves through the order's territories, but the Polish-Lithuanian alliance didn't stop at victory. They marched directly toward Malbork, hoping to deliver the final blow. As the enemy army approached, Malbork prepared. Its walls were tall, its supplies vast, and its defenders determined. The new Grand Master, Heinrich von Plauen, a brilliant strategist, took command. Siege engines were built, defenses reinforced, archers took their posts. For 2 months, the Allied armies tried to breach Malbork's defenses, but the castle held. Arrows rained from battlements, boiling oil spilled from murder holes, disease and supply shortages plagued the attackers. Eventually, the besiegers withdrew. Though bruised, the order survived for now. But Grunwald marked the turning point. The aura of invincibility was gone, and while Malbork's walls had withstood the siege, the empire they guarded had begun to crack. Though Malbork Castle had survived the siege of 1410, the Teutonic Order was never the same. Their decisive loss at the Battle of Grunwald had shattered the illusion of dominance. The once rising tide of their theocratic empire began to recede. Their territories remained vast, their fortress impenetrable, but their grip on power was loosening, slowly, then all at once. The order struggled under the weight of debt, war reparations, and internal unrest. To fund their defense and rebuild their armies, they imposed heavy taxes on their subjects, especially on the growing class of German-speaking merchants and townspeople. But loyalty had its limits. Discontent simmered across Prussia, fueled by economic hardship and the increasingly autocratic behavior of the knights. In 1454, the situation erupted. a powerful confederation of Prussian nobles and cities, fed up with the order's rule, appealed to King Casimir IV of Poland to incorporate their lands into the Polish crown. The king agreed, sparking the 13 Years' War, a brutal grinding conflict that would decide the fate of Malbork and the Teutonic state. At first, the order held fast. Malbork remained their jewel, their stronghold, but the tide had turned against them. The Polish army, backed by the rebellious Prussian League, pushed deep into Teutonic territory. Unable to pay their mercenaries, the knights made a fatal mistake. In 1457, facing bankruptcy, the Teutonic orders hired troops at Malbork, largely Bohemian mercenaries, sold the castle to the Polish king, not with swords or siege towers, but with silver. Poland walked through Malbork's gates, not as conquerors, but as buyers. The greatest fortress in Christendom had changed hands without a battle. The Teutonic Knights retreated to Königsberg. Their state, though not entirely destroyed, was fractured and humiliated. Malbork, once the nerve center of a militant order, was now a royal residence of the Polish monarchy. From this point on, it would serve kings, not crusaders. The fall of Malbork marked the collapse of the order's imperial dreams. Their fortress had stood against catapults, sieges, and swordplay, but in the end, it fell to economics and betrayal. The age of the warrior monks was over, and the brick walls that once echoed with prayers and battle plans now whispered of decline. With the fall of the Teutonic Knights in 1457, Malbork Castle entered a new era. No longer the domain of crusader monks, but now a jewel in the crown of the Polish monarchy. King Casimir IV Jagiellon, who acquired the fortress through payment rather than conquest, recognized Malbork not only as a military asset, but also as a potent symbol of Polish ascendancy over Teutonic decline. Malbork became one of the royal residences of the Polish kings, particularly valued for its size, strategic location, and grandeur. Though it had been built for defense and monastic discipline, its architecture lent itself surprisingly well to courtly life. The once austere halls of the knights were softened with tapestries and banners. Grand receptions and diplomatic gatherings replaced chapter meetings and war councils. The castle was integrated into the royal Prussian territories, which were semi-autonomous but loyal to the Polish crown. This placed Malbork at the heart of a multicultural and economically vibrant region. The castle's administrative functions shifted accordingly. Its armories gave way to treasuries, and its watchtowers monitored trade routes rather than warpaths. Under Polish rule, Malbork underwent selective renovations. New wings were added, and defensive features were updated to reflect the changing nature of warfare, particularly the rising threat of gunpowder. Cannon platforms and bastions were integrated into the older Gothic structures, blending medieval design with Renaissance pragmatism. Yet for all its prestige, Malbork's role as a royal residence was seasonal and ceremonial. The Polish kings maintained their primary court in Krakow or Warsaw, visiting Malbork occasionally to oversee affairs in Prussia or host visiting dignitaries. The castle became a symbol of unity and triumph, a reminder of Poland's victory over the order and its expanding influence in the Baltic region. Despite its reduced military significance, Malbork remained a key stronghold in the defense of northern Poland. It was garrisoned, maintained, and respected, but it was no longer feared. The fortress had traded its monastic discipline for courtly ceremony, its warlike purpose for political prestige. Still, beneath the banners and fine garments, the thick walls and deep moats remained silent, enduring, and waiting. Though the kings had come, the castle's days of peace would not last forever. By the early 17th century, Malbork Castle once again found itself caught in the crosswinds of war. This time, not as a symbol of rising power, but as a coveted prize in the geopolitical chessboard of Northern Europe. The Swedish-Polish Wars, part of a broader struggle for dominance around the Baltic Sea, would test the fortress anew. Sweden, under the ambitious kings Gustavus Adolphus and later Charles II Gustav, sought control of the Baltic coastline, the so-called Dominium Maris Baltici. Poland, with its sprawling but decentralized commonwealth, stood in the way. The wars between the two powers were long and bitter, driven by religious divides, dynastic rivalry, and the race for regional supremacy. In 1626, the Swedes invaded Royal Prussia. Their disciplined, modernized army quickly advanced, capturing key cities and ports. Malbork, with its thick walls and strategic location along the Nogat River, became a major objective. Though fortified, the castle was no longer the unbreakable bastion it had been in the age of the Teutonic Knights. Cannon fire, now more powerful and accurate than ever before, could batter down even the sturdiest Gothic walls. In 1656, during the cataclysmic period known in Poland as the Deluge, Malbork finally fell. Swedish troops entered the fortress, not as besiegers this time, but through surrender. The castle, undermanned and poorly supplied, could not withstand a prolonged assault. Once again, Malbork changed hands without a dramatic battle, but the impact was no less severe. Under Swedish occupation, the castle was looted and partially damaged. Priceless artifacts, treasures, and archives were carted away to Stockholm. The once revered halls of diplomacy and faith echoed with the tread of foreign boots. For the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this loss was not just territorial. It was deeply symbolic. Malbork had stood as a triumph of Polish power for 2 centuries. Now it was another casualty of a nation under siege. The Swedes held the castle for several years until Poland regained it as part of its eventual, though costly, recovery. But the damage had been done. Malbork was now a fortress marked by occupation, its role as a royal seat fading, its scars visible in shattered walls and empty chapels. War had returned, and Malbork had weathered the storm, but not unscathed. By the 18th century, Malbork Castle, once the beating heart of a military monastic state and later a proud symbol of Polish kingship, had faded into quiet obscurity. The political world around it was unraveling. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, weakened by internal strife and foreign interference, faced its final partition in 1795, disappearing entirely from the map. Malbork, like much of the region, was absorbed by the expanding Kingdom of Prussia. Under Prussian rule, the castle's strategic importance had all but vanished. Gunpowder warfare had rendered medieval fortresses largely obsolete. Malbork was no longer a royal seat, no longer a symbol of conquest. It was a massive, aging structure that was too expensive to maintain and too awkward to modernize. The Prussian authorities found new, mundane uses for its vast halls and echoing chambers. The chapel, where Teutonic knights had once prayed, became a warehouse. The refectories turned into barracks. Even parts of the ornate interiors were gutted to make room for storage and military supplies. Some structures were dismantled entirely, with bricks repurposed for other buildings in the area. The castle was treated less as a historic monument and more as a convenient pile of usable material. Locals and soldiers alike began to forget its past. Centuries of religious, political, and military legacy were buried beneath dust and indifference. Visitors noted its decaying towers, its collapsed arches, and ivy-covered walls. The once proud fortress was now little more than a shell of faded glory, a relic too large to ignore, yet too costly to restore. But even in its decline, Malbork never fully disappeared. Travelers from Germany and beyond occasionally came to marvel at its size, sketch its silhouette, and wonder at its forgotten grandeur. Romantic-era artists and thinkers, enchanted by medieval ruins and stories of chivalry, began to see the castle not as obsolete, but as timeless, a frozen echo of a more heroic age. Still, the castle remained largely neglected, no longer defended, no longer ruled, no longer celebrated. Malbork stood in silence. The walls that had once rung with battle cries, processions, and royal decrees now held only dust, shadows, and memories. It would take a new century, a rising interest in national identity, and a wave of historical romanticism to breathe life back into its weathered bricks. In the 19th century, Malbork Castle's long silence was finally broken. As nationalism swept through Europe, so too did a newfound reverence for the medieval past. Ruins became relics. Forgotten fortresses became touchstones of cultural pride. For the Germans, now seeking a unified identity, Malbork, or Marienburg as they called it, emerged as a symbol of Teutonic strength and romanticized knighthood. The restoration began in earnest in the 1800s, led by Prussian architects and historians who saw in the decaying bricks not just a structure, but a story. Detailed studies were conducted. Gothic motifs were carefully reimagined. Sections were rebuilt with painstaking attention to medieval styles, though often with a touch of 19th century artistic license. The process wasn't always historically accurate. Some elements were idealized rather than authentic, but the spirit of revival was strong. Malbork became a national monument of the German Empire. Paintings, operas, and textbooks depicted it as a cradle of Teutonic glory. German emperors visited, and ceremonies were held in its great halls. It was no longer just a castle, it was heritage, myth, and architecture fused into a single powerful icon. But history's tides would shift again. After World War I, the region was contested. After World War II, it was transformed. In 1945, as Soviet forces advanced into East Prussia, Malbork suffered heavy bombardment. Fires gutted the interiors, walls crumbled. Once again, the castle was at war, and once again, it was left in ruins. After the war, Malbork became part of a reborn Poland, and its identity changed once more. No longer a symbol of German pride, it became a reclaimed piece of Polish history, not for conquest, but for preservation. The post-war Polish government undertook another massive restoration, this time aiming for historical fidelity and cultural inclusivity. Brick by brick, it was rebuilt, not as a fortress of war, but as a monument to resilience. Today, Malbork Castle stands as the largest brick fortress in the world, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and a testament to nearly 8 centuries of European history. Tourists wander its courtyards. Historians study its layers. Its walls, once stained by siege and politics, now echo with the voices of schoolchildren and the quiet awe of visitors. Malbork no longer defends. It remembers. In the early 1800s, the United States was a young nation with restless ambitions. Its eastern cities were growing. But for many Americans, the real promise lay beyond the Appalachian Mountains in the vast, untamed wilderness of the West. This desire to expand was more than a personal impulse. It was wrapped in a national philosophy known as manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined by providence or purpose to settle from the Atlantic to the Pacific, no matter what or who stood in the way. What began as a trickle of brave homesteaders soon swelled into a mass movement. By wagon, horseback, and on foot, thousands of families ventured into the frontier, drawn by the hope of cheap land, fresh opportunity, and the chance to escape debt, poverty, or overcrowded cities. Land grants, homesteading laws, and glowing newspaper editorials promised fertile soil, freedom, and ownership, all waiting for the bold to take. But the journey west was not for the faint of heart. Pioneers faced weeks, even months of grueling travel. Trails like the Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, and California Trail became lifelines across mountains, rivers, and plains. Supplies were packed tightly into wagons, which served as both transportation and temporary homes. Dangers lurked everywhere. River crossings, animal attacks, broken axles, and disease could strike without warning. And yet, the pull of the West remained irresistible. For many, the idea of carving out a piece of the frontier was more than a land grab. It was a shot at reinvention. A poor tenant farmer could become a landowner. An immigrant with no inheritance could start anew. On the frontier, there were no neighbors to impress, no aristocracy to navigate only raw land and the will to tame it. The frontier was also a place of contradiction. It promised freedom, but it came at the cost of displacing indigenous peoples whose lands were redefined as wilderness. It offered opportunity, but only for those strong or fortunate enough to survive. Still, the myth of the frontier of rugged individuals braving the unknown became woven into the American identity. And for those first pioneers, life on the frontier was not just a dream. It was a gamble taken 1 mile, 1 river, and 1 wooden wheel at a time. Once the journey west was complete, if it was completed at all, the real work began. The American frontier did not welcome settlers with ready-made homes or planted fields. It offered only trees, soil, weather, and time. For pioneers, establishing a homestead meant transforming raw wilderness into a space that could sustain life, starting with the most basic necessity: shelter. A log cabin was the structure of choice, not for comfort but for practicality. Trees were abundant and tools were few. A family might arrive at their chosen plot with little more than an axe, a wagon of supplies, and sheer determination. First, they cleared the land. Then came the notching and stacking of logs, fitted without nails, secured with mud and moss. Roofs were often made of split logs or thatched grass. Windows were rare luxuries. If present, they were small and often covered with greased paper instead of glass. Inside, life was harsh but purposeful. One-room cabins housed entire families, sometimes a dozen people or more, all under the same roof. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Cooking was done over open hearths, and smoke often filled the cramped space. Bedding might be straw stuffed into cloth sacks. Furniture was rough-hewn and homemade. Every item served a function. There was no room for decoration-only survival. But even in these difficult conditions, life began to take shape. Gardens were planted, small livestock raised. Children gathered firewood and fetched water from nearby streams. Women cooked, preserved food, spun cloth, and tended to illness. Men hunted, trapped, built fences, and defended the homestead when necessary. Each season brought new labor, planting, harvesting, chopping wood, preserving food for winter. Rest was rare. Neighbors were few and far between, but when they did exist, they were invaluable. Frontier families often worked communally, raising barns together, helping each other during childbirth or gathering for seasonal harvests. Survival depended not only on independence, but also on a fragile web of mutual aid. On the American frontier, nature was both provider and adversary. While the land held the promise of bounty, it offered nothing freely. Every meal, every warm fire, every drop of clean water had to be earned through sweat, skill, and endurance. There were no markets, no electricity, no stocked pantries, only what could be grown, gathered, hunted, or preserved. Food was a daily concern, not a convenience. In the early months of settlement, many families relied on hardtack, salted pork, dried beans, and flour brought from the east. These supplies, though essential, dwindled quickly. The long-term solution was self-sufficiency. Gardens were planted as soon as the ground thawed. Corn, beans, squash, and potatoes were staples. Herbs were grown for both flavor and medicine. Nothing went to waste. A single failed harvest could mean hunger or worse. Meat came from the wilderness. Men and older boys hunted deer, rabbits, wild turkeys, and sometimes larger game like bison. Traps were set for smaller animals. Fishing in nearby creeks provided vital protein, especially during warm months. Every kill was a victory. Every successful forage a small triumph over uncertainty. But nature's gifts came with danger. Bears, wolves, and mountain lions also roamed the land, and starvation was never far off in a bad season. Preserving food for winter was a skill that meant the difference between comfort and calamity. Smokehouses, root cellars, and drying racks were used to keep meat, vegetables, and fruits edible through the cold months. Women boiled jars of jam, cured pork with salt, and pickled anything that could fit in a barrel. Firewood was stacked high by autumn. The hearth was the center of warmth, cooking, and life itself. Weather was unpredictable and often unforgiving. Torrential rains could flood crops, blizzards could isolate families for weeks, droughts turned gardens to dust, lightning struck cabins, tornadoes flattened them, illness spread rapidly when water froze or spoiled. There were no safety nets, only preparation, luck, and resilience. While life on the frontier is often remembered as solitary and rugged, few pioneers truly lived in total isolation. Survival might begin with a single cabin, but over time, scattered homesteads grew into something more, communities bound by necessity, trust, and the shared challenge of taming the land. Neighbors, though miles apart, were lifelines. In the absence of formal institutions, frontier families relied on one another. Barn raisings, harvests, log rollings, and quilting bees were more than chores. They were social events. A dozen men could raise a structure in a day. Women would prepare food, care for children, and offer news from miles away. These moments built bonds stronger than fences. They made survival a shared effort. Without newspapers, telegraphs, or town criers, news traveled by word of mouth. A traveling trader or a visitor from a nearby settlement could bring stories from hundreds of miles away. Political changes, rumors of war, sightings of native tribes, or news of a harsh winter coming. Such information passed from cabin to cabin like wildfire. When a family received a letter, it was often read aloud multiple times to friends and neighbors, becoming a shared window into the world beyond. Religion played a unifying role. Itinerant preachers, often called circuit riders, traveled long routes, delivering sermons in cabins, barns, or open fields. Families would walk for hours just to attend a Sunday service, turning it into a full-day event of prayer, song, and fellowship. Faith provided comfort and moral structure in a world where law was still taking root. Education was scarce, but valued. When enough children lived nearby, families might band together to build a one-room schoolhouse. A young woman or older child might teach using a Bible, a slate, and whatever few books were available. Community events like spelling bees and holiday gatherings offered rare joy and a sense of normalcy amid the hardships. Life on the frontier was not only a struggle against nature, it was also a collision of peoples, cultures, and claims to the land. As settlers moved westward, they entered territories long inhabited by Native American tribes. For the pioneers, the land was a promise. For indigenous peoples, it was home. The result was a tense, often violent balance between conflict and coexistence. Some encounters were peaceful. Trade was common along major trails. Settlers exchanged metal tools, cloth, or firearms for furs, food, and local knowledge. Native guides sometimes helped families navigate unfamiliar terrain or warned them of incoming storms. There were moments of genuine friendship, shared meals, gifts, and quiet understanding across the cultural divide. But these moments were fragile, and the pressure of expansion would strain them to breaking. As more homesteads appeared, so did tensions over land and resources. Settlers cleared forests, diverted water, hunted game unaware or indifferent to the fact that these lands were deeply tied to the spiritual, economic, and ancestral life of native nations. Treaties were signed, then broken. Promises were made, then ignored. As a result, hostility grew. Raids occurred on both sides. Some settlers feared attacks at night. Homes were fortified. Rifles kept close. Children taught to stay quiet and hidden. Stories of violence, whether exaggerated or true, traveled fast and stoked fear. At the same time, indigenous communities saw their lands shrink, their hunting grounds vanish, and their way of life threatened by unfamiliar laws and permanent fences. Militias were formed, forts were built. Entire conflicts erupted, from small skirmishes to full-scale wars like the Black Hawk War or the clashes along the Oregon Trail. Some native tribes chose to fight, others tried diplomacy or moved further west, only to face more settlers in time. There was no simple resolution. Yet, even amid conflict, instances of cooperation endured. Some Native Americans worked alongside settlers, married into families, or converted to Christianity. Some settlers adopted indigenous farming methods, herbal medicine, or winter survival techniques. The frontier was a place of blurred lines, not always war, not always peace. On the American frontier, survival was often credited to grit, strength, and resilience. And no one embodied these traits more quietly and completely than the women of the wilderness. While frontier tales often spotlight men blazing trails or fending off wolves, it was the labor, intelligence, and endurance of women that held frontier life together, day after grueling day. Women wore many roles, often at once. They were mothers, doctors, teachers, farmers, hunters, and protectors, expected to work from sunrise to long after sunset. A pioneer wife might begin her day kindling the fire, milking the cow, and preparing breakfast. From there, she churned butter, mended clothing, tended to children, gathered herbs, and maintained the garden. In emergencies, she delivered babies, dressed wounds, and sat beside the dying with no formal training and often no help. Yet, women were not confined to the home. Many worked the fields beside their husbands, chopped wood, or helped build cabins. Some hunted small game. Others drove wagons during the westward journey, managing oxen and navigating rugged terrain when men were injured or away. When widowed, which was not uncommon, they took on entire homesteads alone, raising children and crops with little more than raw determination. Women also brought culture, learning, and continuity. In isolated regions with no schools, they taught their children to read and write using family Bibles and borrowed books. They kept diaries, wrote letters, and recorded recipes and remedies documents that later became rich historical records. Through them, we see the human side of the frontier, the longing for community, the struggle against loneliness, the quiet pride in a well-baked loaf or a warm quilt. They also formed the spiritual and emotional core of many frontier communities. Women organized prayer meetings, holiday gatherings, and mutual aid networks. When a neighbor was ill, they brought broth and comfort. When a child died, they dug the graves and mourned together. Their strength was not always loud, but it was ever-present, steady as the hearth fire. For children on the American frontier, life was not defined by toys or school books, but by responsibility, resilience, and resourcefulness. From an early age, frontier boys and girls were expected to contribute to the family's survival. Childhood was brief and often harsh, shaped by hard labor, long winters, and the ever-present challenges of a wild and changing land. Daily life for frontier children revolved around chores, not play. Boys were taught to chop wood, hunt small game, tend livestock, and protect the homestead. Girls helped with cooking, spinning, milking cows, gardening, and caring for younger siblings. Children as young as 5 had tasks to complete before breakfast. There was little room for idleness when every pair of hands mattered. That said, childhood on the frontier wasn't entirely joyless. Children found time to play with what they had: a rag doll sewn by hand, a carved wooden animal, or a hoop and stick. They invented games using stones, sticks, or imagination, often drawing from stories passed down around the hearth. Social gatherings like harvests or barn dances offered rare chances for fun and interaction with other children, sometimes many miles away. Education was a privilege, not a guarantee. In many regions, there were no schools at all. Where schools did exist, they were often one-room cabins with a single teacher instructing children of all ages. Lessons were short, and school terms were often scheduled around planting and harvest seasons. Books were rare, paper even rarer. Children learned by reciting aloud, writing on slates, and memorizing verses, often from the Bible. Despite the hardships, frontier life instilled values that children carried into adulthood: self-reliance, discipline, thrift, and toughness. Children learned to care for animals, cook meals, and repair tools, not for enrichment, but for survival. They witnessed birth, death, and nature's fury up close, often without protection or explanation. These experiences created a maturity far beyond their years. Winter on the American frontier was not a passing season. It was a test of everything a family had prepared for. When the first snow fell, the frontier changed. Trails vanished, rivers froze, trees stood bare, and the wind cut through even the thickest wool. For weeks or even months, isolation became total, and survival depended entirely on what had been done before the cold arrived. Cabins were reinforced. Cracks in the walls were stuffed with moss, clay, or cloth. Firewood was stacked high, cords and cords of it, because once the snow came, going out for more could mean frostbite or worse. The hearth became the heart of the home. Its fire burned day and night, warming the cabin, cooking the food, and offering a fragile sense of normalcy amid the cold. Food preservation was critical. Families who failed to salt enough meat, dry enough vegetables, or store enough grain often went hungry. Root cellars were dug deep, insulated with straw, and stocked with potatoes, onions, and jars of preserves. Meals were simple but heavy: stews, cornbread, dried fruit, and beans meant to stretch as far as possible. But beyond hunger and cold, loneliness posed its own danger. Weeks might pass without seeing another soul. Snowdrifts made travel nearly impossible. Letters from back east arrived late, if at all. The silence of the woods was profound. For some, especially women and children, the solitude became unbearable. Cabin fever, anxiety, and depression were common, though rarely spoken of. Families passed the time with what they had: storytelling, Bible reading, mending clothes, carving tools, or patching quilts. Children played quietly indoors, learning to entertain themselves without much space or distraction. Every day was measured by the fire's glow and the stores in the cellar. But even in the deepest cold, endurance took root. Winter was a season of waiting for the sun to rise a little earlier, for the snow to melt, for the earth to soften again beneath tired boots. And when spring finally came, with its thawing creeks and returning birds, frontier families emerged from their cabins, thinner but alive. By the late 19th century, the American frontier had begun to fade. Railroads cut across the plains, towns rose where once there was only forest, and the once vast wilderness was divided by fences and deeds. But the legacy of the frontier, its culture, values, and myths, endured long after the last wagon wheel creaked westward. The U.S. Census of 1890 famously declared the frontier closed. The land had been settled, mapped, and claimed. Homesteads became farms, cabins became towns, and territories became states. What had once been a dangerous and unpredictable edge of civilization was now part of the nation's center. Yet, the story of the frontier remained deeply embedded in American identity, shaped by those who had endured it. The people who settled the frontier left behind more than log cabins and split rail fences. They left a national character built on self-reliance, perseverance, and innovation. The idea that one could carve out a life with their own two hands became central to the American dream. The frontier ideal romanticized hard work, personal freedom, and rugged independence values still echoed in modern culture, politics, and folklore. But this legacy was complex. The same expansion that brought opportunity to settlers came at a devastating cost to native peoples. Tribes were displaced, treaties broken, cultures disrupted or destroyed. The landscape itself was forever changed. Forests cleared, rivers redirected, wildlife hunted nearly to extinction. The triumph of the frontier came with irreversible consequences. Still, the stories endured. Frontier diaries, oral histories, and family legends kept the spirit of those early years alive. Pioneers became icons, men like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, women like Laura Ingalls Wilder representing courage and endurance. Their lives were transformed into books, songs, and later films. The reality was often harsher than the legend, but the myth carried meaning. Today, remnants of the frontier still stand, weathered cabins, wagon ruts, and gravestones carved by hand. Museums and historic sites preserve the artifacts, but the truest legacy lies in the enduring sense of possibility that the frontier inspired. The belief that a person, no matter their origin, could start over, endure hardship, and leave something behind.